Good afternoon. My name is Jacqueline Anderson, and today we will be talking about racial discrimination in the American education system. This is one of my multimodal projects for my honors writing course this semester. A lot of times when people first think about racial discrimination in the American education system, they consider that we have come a very long way. A lot of reactions to statements about racism in schools are mainly overlooked with the comments of, well, Brown versus the Board of Education passed, so there can't be any discrimination in schools anymore. Many people to this are blind and are surrounded by their own privilege that allows them to not see the discrimination that is occurring. A lot of times people fail to realize all of the incidences that happened after Brown versus the Board of Education that truly did limit the proper integration of Black students into white schools. After Brown versus Board of Education passed, the Southern Manifesto was written by many of the Southern states. Basically, this document wrote out that the Southern states would do anything in their power to eliminate Black students from entering their schools. A lot of times this encompassed tearing down schools that were already in place so that no students could enter, opening up white private schools only that could have their own regulations to exempt Black students from attending. Or they would try and fund Black schools more than the white schools so that they would try and keep their students there and not integrate them into society. After this, Swan versus the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County Board of Education passed. This said that Black students would now be bused out of their predominantly Black school districts into white school districts. This was an attempt to force integration into schools, but it ended up proving to be a failure. By sending Black students sometimes more than 20 miles away from their homes, they would be put into a new social situation that they were not prepared for. A lot of times, Black parents could not even be really involved with their children at school anymore because they were so far from their students. A lot of times, students now felt out of place due to their race, social status, or different cultural backgrounds than many of their peers. After the busing system was considered to be a failure and not implemented in schools, they started to form neighborhood schools. Basically, this meant that they would try and build new schools in predominantly Black and white neighborhoods to keep students where they were. This limited integration, but they felt that it would be better for students because they could be in a culturally inclusive environment that was similar to the one that they currently experienced. While many people think that a lot of this is considered progress, they fail to realize the lack of progress that's actually occurred. From 1954 to 1988, Black children in schools, predominantly white schools, rose from 0% to 43.5%. But from 1988 to 2011, this fell back to 23.2%. If anything, this certainly shows that there has not been a good enough job done of integrating schools in America. Now we're going to watch a brief crash course video on the civil rights movement and talks about Brown versus the Board of Education.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one part in the Double V Crusade. But even before that, Black Americans had been fighting for civil rights. It's just that in the 1950s, they started to win. So desegregating schools was a key goal of the civil rights movement, and it started in California in 1946. In the case of Mendez versus Westminster, the California Supreme Court ruled that Orange County, of all places, had to desegregate their schools. They'd been discriminating against Latinos. And then California's governor, Earl Warren, signed an order that repealed all school segregation in the state. That same Earl Warren, by the way, was Chief Justice when the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education came before the Supreme Court in 1954. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, had been pursuing a legal strategy of trying to make states live up to the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson that required all public facilities to be separate but equal. They started by bringing lawsuits against professional schools, like law schools, because it was really obvious that the 3 classrooms and no library that Texas set up for its African-American law students were not equal to the actual University of Texas's law school. But the Brown case was about public schools for children. It was actually a combination of 5 cases from 4 states, of which Brown happened to be alphabetically the first. The Board of Education in question, incidentally, was in Topeka, Kansas, not one of the states of the old Confederacy, but nonetheless a city that did restricted schooling by race. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Stan, the last 2 weeks you have given me two extraordinary gifts, and I am thankful. It is Earl Warren from Brown versus Board of Education. Huzzah! Justice Warren is actually quoting from sociological research there that shows that segregation itself is psychologically damaging to Black children because they recognize that being separated out is a badge of inferiority. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The Brown decision was a watershed, but it didn't lead to massive, immediate desegregation of the nation's public schools. In fact, it spawned what came to be known as massive resistance in the South. The resistance got so massive, in fact, that a number of counties, rather than integrate their schools, closed them. Prince Edward County in Virginia, for instance, closed its schools in 1959 and didn't reopen them again until 1964. Except they didn't really close them because many states appropriated funds to pay for white students to attend, quote, private academies. Some states got so into the resistance that they began to fly the Confederate battle flag over their state capitol buildings. Yes, I'm looking at you, Alabama and South Carolina. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa...
That was just a quick little video with some background on Brown versus Board of Education and some demonstrations to show that once it was put into effect, it was not as effective as many people thought.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course.
So now we're going to talk about what racism actually looks like in schools. So one of the things that racism looks like is improper school funding. As an example, East St. Louis High School, which is located in Illinois, but just on the side of St. Louis, has has labs that don't restart the slide. So now we're going to talk about what racism actually looks like in schools. A lot of people think that racism only looks like verbal acts and attacks and physical actions against people, but they would be wrong. One of the ways that racism looks like in schools is improper school funding. East St. Louis High School, which is a predominantly Black high school, has increasingly less funding than schools that are 20 miles away in St. Louis that have exponential funds. They, in their science laboratories, don't even have actual lab tables, while if you travel 20 minutes to a private school in St. Louis, they have massive funds with beautiful gyms and equipment and technology. So the reason that they aren't funding to these schools is because these schools are predominantly Black. Jokes and slurs, which are said in school, a lot of times in the hallways, these kinds of things are said without the drop of a hat and no one really cares. And educators need to do a better job at acknowledging that these things are hurtful to students and put a stop to them. A lot of times kids don't even know that the things that they're saying are hurtful towards their peers, and there needs to be a better job of explaining that this is incorrect. Racism also looks like underqualified teachers being given to these suffering schools. 25% of all new teachers are underqualified, and these underqualified teachers are sent to the disadvantaged schools. You would think that the more qualified teachers would be sent to the places where schools need them the most, but the opposite is actually happening because they don't feel that these schools are benefiting and deserving enough of these highly qualified teachers. Racism also looks like teachers providing ill amounts of support to their students of color. A lot of times there have been reports of teachers admitting that they truly don't care about their students' success. And in one article that was discussed in my paper, we talked about how an educator blatantly admitted that they would give the answers to their students because they truly didn't care how their education played out. Racism also looks like limiting opportunities for Black and other students of color. There's an overrepresentation of Black and colored students in special education programs. And this is because instead of recognizing the cultural differences between these students, they are labeled as disabilities, and teachers do not try and work their education towards their students and the different beliefs that they have. Instead, they choose to label them as disabled and put them in these special programs. There's also an underrepresentation of Black and colored students in gifted programs in high school. And this is because of the biases that teachers have because they feel like these students are not able to complete at such a higher academic level than many of their peers. Racism also looks like improper discipline. Students of color are much more likely to be suspended and receive punishment than students of white color. A lot of times, microaggressions such as a pushing on the playground or a disagreement during class is taken to much further extremes when students are black or a student of color than they are in a white student. And this quote says, while black kids make up 18% of the school's preschool enrollment, they represent 48% of the students receiving one or more suspensions. Obviously, the statistic is not correct by any means because if students are barely making up a fourth of the student population, yet they're making up half of the suspensions, something clearly must be wrong. Here are two graphs that are showing student expulsion and improper suspension in schools. So on the chart on the left here, you can see students suspended and expelled from high schools by race and Hispanic origin. So you can see that the black students were expelled or suspended from school at much higher rates than any of the other students. Multicultural will come in at second, but compared to white students, there is over a 10% increase in these racial groups. And that is not just a coincidence. It is because educators and administration feel that students of color are less deserving and are more aggressive than white students. In the chart on the right here, it talks about how black students are disproportionately suspended in this Wake Mecklenburg counties. So you can see black students that are totally enrolled in these districts are 24 and 40%, which is nowhere near close to half. Well, of course, the 40% is, but they are not even half of the student population. Yet in both of these districts, they make up over half of the suspensions. Again, same thing is stated with the other chart. This is not a coincidence. It is due to biases and racism that exist in schools. I'm going to move myself here. Laura Lindo, who is an educational activist and a member of provincial parliament in Ontario, Canada, gave a TED Talk where she talked about the racial injustice that occurs in schools. And she says that no sense of belonging plus no sense of urgency equals cycles of racial injustice in schools. And what she means by this is that when students do not feel that they belong in schools because of the racist incidents that they see, the ill support, the lacking and limiting of opportunities, and whenever they see that their school districts aren't putting a sense of urgency into solving these issues and putting people of color at the forefront of this and being able to put them at the decision-making table, cycles of racial injustice in schools will only continue to repeat. So while we can talk about the racial incidences that happens in schools, we need to talk about the instances that occur as a result of racism. One result that racism causes is academic disidentification. This is something that usually happens around the fourth grade, and this is a phenomenon where students' self-esteem is disconnected from how they perform in schools. A lot of times, students of color will feel, because of the ill support that they receive, that school is not the place for them. They tend to identify with things like sports or activities that have nothing to do with school in general. They feel that school is not a place for them, it's not welcoming, which is the opposite and it's what school should be for every single student. And this only stems to issues later in life because when they feel that school is not a place for them, they begin stopping their attempts to even succeed in school. And a lot of times these students are then labeled as lazy or unmotivated when in fact they truly just don't feel like school is where they belong. Results of racism also include low graduation and higher education rates. And a lot of times, school or children of color who do graduate high school and do go on to higher education tend to go to schools where there are low graduation rates and higher populations of students of color because, one, this is where they feel more accepted. But the fact that students at these schools have lower graduation rates only shows that the cycle continues just at higher education levels. Mental health issues also stem from racism, and they occur at much earlier ages than students of white color receive. And these things include depression, anxiety, feelings of disconnected in their schools, panic, worriness, living in a survival mode. And a lot of times, students who develop these issues also develop improper coping strategies for these issues. And a lot of times, these students feel that they are deserving of such mental issues and they don't discuss them. Racism also ingrains an idea that students of color are considered less than their white peers. As we're going to see on the next slide, we're going to watch a CNN study where students are asked to identify the good versus the bad students. And a lot of time, even students as young as kindergarten feel as though the students of color are considered bad while white students aren't considered good. And the insufficient education that these students of color receive results to them being sent into society, into the workforce, with an improper preparation for their future. This allows them to not be able to receive as successful job opportunities. And a lot of times the jobs that they will be set up into, they will fail at because they've been failed by their school district and their education to be able to fully succeed in it. So now we're going to watch a CNN study that is going to show how young children view race in schools.
Ready, set, go.
Our second major finding, even Black children as a whole have some bias toward whiteness, but far less than white children.
Show me the smart child. And why is she the smart child?
Because she is white.
Okay. Show me the dumb child. And why is she the dumb child?
She plays.
Well, show me the ugly child. And why is she the ugly child?
Because she plays.
Show me the good-looking child. And why is she the good-looking child?
Because she likes skating.
And show me the skin color you believe most teachers think looks bad on a girl.
I don't think it matters. Because I think each teacher wants to help a student learn either way what they look like. And it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside, it just matters what you look like on the inside.
Show me the good-looking child.
They look the same.
Yeah? Show me the child you would like as a classmate.
All of them.
You like all of them as classmates? Why do you say all of them?
Because I don't really care what color they have.
This 5-year-old girl gave some provocative answers during her test. I asked her about them later.
How about you? Why do you want that skin color?
Because it looks lighter than this kind, because this looks a lot like that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I just don't like the way brown looks, because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason. That's all.
So you think it looks nasty?
Well, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes. And Brielle, they asked what color adults don't like. Do you remember what you said? Which one? That's right. That's what you said. Why do you think adults don't like that color?
Dark.
Dark. And adults, you think adults don't like dark?
Well, maybe some adults do, but maybe some of them don't.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white biased answers?
Show me the one you think most children would think looks bad on a boy.
More than 70% of the older Black children chose the darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like.
More than 61% of the younger Black children chose the 2 darkest shades.
Show me the ugly child.
More than 57% of the younger Black kids chose the 2 darkest shades. Dr. Spencer says the research shows the bias toward white is still very much part of our culture.
All kids are exposed to these stereotypes, but what's really significant here is that white children are learning or maintaining those stereotypes much more strongly than the African American children.
And that is our third finding, the finding that interested Dr. Spencer the most, that overall younger and older children keep the same patterns, stereotyping. In other words, their ideas change little from age 5 to 10.
Ordinarily, by the time children are older, there's this sort of a natural filter, their own ways of thinking sort of aids them in sort of rethinking the extreme stereotypic sort of responses to become less highly biased.
That left Professor Spencer wondering what's causing this pattern. She speculates that kids are bombarded by stereotypical messages and that adults in kids' lives have to fight to override the deluge. Black parents may be more diligent about that, while white parents may not notice the need.
The messages are the same for all children, and therefore the task is the same for all parents. Parents have to reframe what children experience.
We realize these findings may be disturbing and that some people will question this project's conclusions. What stereotypic messages are being sent in a country that elected a Black man president?
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
Like all research projects, ours is not perfect. Some kids were told ahead of time they'd be asked about race. Some children identified as one race but came from biracial families, like this boy whose mom is white. But Professor Spencer tells us these are common issues in research and the results can still be trusted because of the sample size. To be clear, this is a scientifically informed and executed pilot study, which suggests the need for further research. The results point to major trends, but are not the definitive word on children and race. Still, they underline what Dr. Spencer sees as an alarming conclusion.
We are still living in a society where dark things are devalued and light things are valued.
The question we're left with is, where do we go from here? Anderson Cooper, CNN.
Obviously, from watching this video, it's very obvious that we can see that students at incredibly young ages are being taught that for some reason, students of color and of darker skin tones are less than their white peers. So now we're going to talk about some classroom issues that racism causes. So a farmer who wrote an article considers that what magnifies discriminatory practices of education by zip codes are the deep-rooted biases, which are conscious or unconscious by the education staff. So the biases that educators grow up with, that they're surrounded with every day, that a lot of times they choose to suppress and choose to ignore that they don't have, are what stimulate racism at schools. A lot of times teachers are unaware of these biases because for a lot of them, it's just second nature. It's how they grew up. This does not mean it's acceptable, but a lot of times these are unconscious biases that they don't truly understand that they are exhibiting. Another issue that can cause is that a lot of times white teachers are found primarily in colored districts. And while this is not an innate problem, a lot of times these white teachers do grow up with cultural differences than their students. And if these white teachers don't attempt to understand the different cultures of their students and appreciate them, and instead of looking at them differently, this will indeed cause issues in their classrooms. Another issue that occurs in classrooms is the whitewashing of US textbooks, which is a way that students learn and they feel that people of color are less than white students. This quote here says, textbooks discuss acts of violence by non-white groups towards white people using the active voice, while describing violence by white Native Americans towards non-whites in the passive voice, which previous studies have found different impact readers' capacities, not only to recall, but also to emphasize such hardship narratives. So the way that textbooks are written is even trying to show that white people aren't in the wrong in situations against colored people. And this again only leads to faulty education and a improper learning of race and racial issues in schools. In-classroom issues also include hurtful jokes, and this was also mentioned earlier. When these jokes or slurs are said in class and there is nothing done to address it, students then think that this is okay and that they are allowed to say these rude things to their students with no consequences. And the top picture is an example of a discriminatory practice in schools. As you can see, there are all white children sitting at one table. In the corner, there's a table full of black children. And while this is something that we don't know the background of the image, we don't know if this was done consciously or unconsciously, it is still seen as discriminatory practices in schools. So now we're going to talk about ways that schools combat racism. And I say combat in quotes here because schools truly, and not all schools, do a pretty faulty job at addressing racism. So many educators first choose to see themselves as colorblind in the first place. And what they mean by colorblind is that they don't see race or they don't see the differences between their students. This ultimately is not a good practice for educators to take into place, because this leads to issues with not appreciating other cultures and accepting people for who they are. Instead, they choose to see all their students as the same, which is not the case. Students are different, whether that is their education level, any disabilities that they have, the race, their culture, and these things should be appreciated and not looked at as barriers between individuals. A lot of times schools will try to have cultural assemblies, but a lot of times these are failures. I'm sure we can all remember attempts during Black History Month or something like that, where someone would come in and they would speak about their culture or about race. And a lot of times these would be a one-time assembly done once a year, and the information would go in one ear and out the other. And a lot of times schools would do these assemblies and then pat themselves on the back because they feel that they have done something to try and establish the importance of cultural differences when in reality they're failures. A lot of times schools teach the bare minimum about race. They don't choose to teach the science that is behind race, and a lot of times this leads to a failed understanding of race in general. Their state standards for race are different in every single state. And it is up to the state and the school itself to determine what they are going to teach and the way they do it. But when you teach the bare minimum and say that race is only just the way that one looks and that it's a dividing factor between us, this is such a failed representation of race and what it means to be a person of color. Another way that schools combat racism is by hugging out racism. And this is a coin that was turned by Laura Lindo in her TED Talk. And we are going to watch a clip from it where she explains what hugging out racism is.
Racism means that the cycles of racial injustice continue in schools. This is the part when I think what we are accustomed to doing is hugging out racism. It's hilarious to me too, me and you. Hugging out racism, what does that mean? It means exactly what we do right now. Racist instant occurs in school. Statement goes out. Focus is on statement.
Racism isn't welcome here. We don't like that. We're inclusive. We like different kinds of people. Come here, different people. Let me hug you.
But no time, attention, or resources are put towards addressing the root cause of the racist experience that just happened. Nobody's checking in with the students to see how they're doing. Nobody's changing the curriculum to make sure that this is addressed. Nobody's doing PD sessions to make sure that they actually do more than just diversity training. Hey, this is off script, but guess what we're gonna do? We're gonna do diversity training. Ready? Look around you. There's different people, right? Training done. What's that gonna do? We have to do a little bit more. And the reason we have to do more is because the people that need to see that we're taking this seriously are the Black, Brown, and Indigenous students in the school. The Black, Brown, and Indigenous staff members, educators, educational workers, administrators, superintendents need to know that you understand that this is urgent.
So in her TED Talk right there, and I encourage all of you, if you have the chance, to watch her entire TED Talk on racism in the education system. But basically what she means by hugging out racism is the fact that when a racist incident occurs in schools, schools like to come out with a blanket statement that, you know, racism isn't welcome here, but they fail to address the fact that it did and it impacted their students in significant ways. And instead of trying to deal with the issues and learn how we can grow from it, they try to just cover up the issue and say that it won't happen again, and this is how we'll do it because we accept all people here. So why can racial issues not be solved? You know, you would think if everyone could just get on the same page that racism does exist in schools, there could be an easy solution to it. But there are a lot of roadblocks that come into place in the education system when talking about racism. So the first issue is that teachers are flat out uncomfortable with talking about race. And a lot of times this is due to improper education on race in general, or the fact that teachers don't want to acknowledge their biases, or the fact that they just feel as though it's not a real issue and are blind to it because of their privilege. Shields writes that teachers prefer the concept of anti-harassment policies to ones of anti-racism. The fact that teachers can't even acknowledge the fact that racism exists in their schools is a big sign that racism exists and that there is not enough being done. The fact that teachers are so uncomfortable with the fact that they can't address the fact that an anti-racism policy needs to be in place shows just their uncomfortability with the issue. And this only leads to students feeling that their issues and they're experiencing aren't real issues and they don't deserve a specific kind of policy in place for them. As I just explained, teachers are undereducated in racial issues. And this includes how they address it. A lot of times teachers just choose to not talk about race in schools. And a lot of times they're blind to what race truly is and the science behind it. A lot of times people are taught that yes, race is, why I have brown eyes or I have blue eyes and someone has brown eyes, or why someone has white skin and someone has brown skin. But they fail to realize the fact that race does not determine anything about one's position to govern, one's educational status, one's social status, one's ability to have a successful future. So while we will say, yes, race is the reason I look different from you, but we fail to educate on the fact that it has no impact over the success that we can have in our lives. Another reason that racial issues cannot be solved in schools is because people of color are not present at the decision-making table. If there are racial issues in schools, you need to have people of color and race who have experienced these things firsthand at the table to make these decisions. Without this, good outcomes and decisions are not going to be put into place. If people don't know what this is like to begin with and are merely watchers of it, they are not going to be able to appropriately make decisions that will help end racism in schools and further steps for growth. One thing is important to understand is that a lot of schools like to put in the idea of equal chance instead of equal opportunity. Equal chance is the blanket statements that are not supported by government law that just assume that every student will possibly have the chance to be provided with an equal education in schools. While equal opportunity is defined by government law, and it will be stated that every student in their district will be given an appropriate chance to succeed, and they will be given all of the resources necessary, and it won't be up to fate or whether they have enough income or what kind of cultural background they come from. And that was all given with chance. It is determined with equal opportunity. We have two quotes here at the bottom that I personally like, that educators must realize that there is no neutral position on the issues of racial injustice. If educators live with that philosophy, it is going to be very, very evident to their students that they don't care about race and they don't care about what makes people different. So teachers need to be an active participant against racism so that they can educate all of their students and make them feel welcome in schools. Another quote from the other side is, feeling fear when conversations about race come up in the classroom isn't the problem. Reacting to the fear by diminishing our students' lived experiences is. A lot of time teachers will feel uncomfortable and possibly scared when issues of race talk are brought up. And that is okay, but what is not okay is shutting down your students and not educating yourself to make yourself aware of these issues so you aren't scared. And when you dismiss students for their experiences that they've had and the fact that they're sharing them with you is what is the issue here, and that is what leads to these cycles of racial injustice. Now, with all of this said, there are things that can be done to help end racism at schools. A big thing just with racism in general is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Teachers and everyone in the world need to be able to have these uncomfortable conversations. You need to call out the fact that you were once undereducated or that your privilege has surrounded you and that you were blind to these issues before, but now you understand. When you're uncomfortable, this provides you with many more opportunities of growth when you stay in your bubble. As a teacher, we all want to push our students to their uncomfortable levels so that they can grow. And the same standard needs to be held of ourselves when dealing with issues such as race. Teachers and people alike need to take it upon yourself to further your own education. There are dozens of books, articles, websites, TED Talks, movies that you can watch to further your education on racism and know how you can not only be someone who is against racism, but an active participant against it. One thing that everyone can do is call out racism and stand up against it. Do not be an active bystander. If you, as a teacher, a student, or just someone in the everyday world witness racism, You need to stand up against it, as that is the only way that these issues can be combated in the world. In schools specifically, we need to push for racially different curriculum that is incorporated. Instead of just talking about Black artists and writers during Black History Month, these things need to be incorporated through the entire curriculum in the school year. In schools, we need to learn to appreciate student differences and not simply acknowledge that students are different. We need to learn what makes them different and appreciate them for what they are and not treat these things as barriers. We need to push administration for concrete rules on racism. A lot of times schools have different policies on racism and how they'll address it, and the way that they handle situation A may be completely different from how they handle situation B. So there need to be overarching principles and rules in progress for being able to deal with racism appropriately. And also schools need to have people of color represented in positive ways. And this includes as teachers, as administrators, as figures that they can learn about and look up to in schools, but not simply just learning in your English class about white writers, but learning about Black, Brown, Indigenous writers too. All of these things need to be incorporated in schools so that way educators can establish the fact that just because someone looks different from you does not mean that they're any less than you. And on the side here, here are 10 different ideas to combat racism in the classroom. So, and a lot of times these could be, depending on what age group that you're teaching, these are really all going to depend, but you could create a class pledge, you could attract allies, you can build bridges between groups, you can imagine and create, you can create artistry that shows that classes are unified as one. You can encourage the exploration of families' cultures by exploring family trees. You can invite storytellers, but this is important to do not just as a one-time incident, but a repeated event. You can invite speakers, again, repeated. You need to celebrate the justice and seekers and the doers in society that did and that are currently making strides towards bettering and equaling the education system. You can visit museums and learn about different cultures. And one of the most important things is you need to get serious about diversity and you need to appreciate it for what it is and not simply just learn the definition and move on. It needs to be incorporated in your classroom in every life. And all of this is important because schools are meant to be a place for all, regardless of race, creed, color, sexual orientation, but not all students can be educated effectively if we are not all on the same page. So overall, schools need to come up with better ways to enforce and deter racist incidents in schools and ensure that education for all does not just mean students of color. And finally, here's my Works Cited page. I encourage all of you to look at some of these websites, as a lot of times they can be eye-opening to you as teachers, and you can see the ways that maybe you have had biases previously, or the ways that say some of your peers do, and you can learn to address them and call them out. And these can be good ways to talk to your administrators and let them know that these situations are real and they surround us every day, and that more needs to be done to protect our students of color in schools. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.